Your best case scenario depends very heavily on some kind of a deal with the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. What in your mind would a power sharing arrangement of that sort look like? Would you have women can go to school in the cities, but Sharia law is and the burqa are the law of the land in the countryside? Would there be any kind of continued American presence, which I know most of the Americans envision some kind of ongoing presence to at least as an anti-Al-Qaeda safeguard? What would this? I mean, realize you're not the chief negotiator, but what in your mind would be a plausible power-sharing deal?
Well, I mean, first of all, I see a very long process. It could take a year or two, And the first part of this process would be obviously trying to culminate in some kind of ceasefire. The Americans hate using the word ceasefire. I would say reduction in violence, a mutual reduction in violence. So some of American attacks would stop in the Taliban areas. Taliban would stop attacking, Afghan civilians, American forces using landmines, etc., etc. Perhaps you would never call it a ceasefire because both sides would wait until the Americans withdraw, and both sides would wait until there was a power-sharing deal. But, you need a lot of military confidence-building measures between the two sides to reduce the violence. Now, once, that is in motion, I think, political talks between the government and the Taliban could start. Possibly, not necessarily with the Americans sitting at the table, but certainly, monitoring them very closely behind the scenes. Now, look, I really do believe that the Taliban in the last year or two have, become more moderate, if you like. I think they have, a lot of their jihadi rhetoric has been replaced by a much more nationalist rhetoric. What they're saying now is that we are Afghans. We are not jihadis. We want the foreign occupation to end by the Americans. We want all the Americans to go home. But we are Afghan patriots and nationalists, and we would do nothing to, now be detrimental to Afghanistan. They have said that they have already distanced themselves from Al-Qaeda and from, they would not allow any foreign terrorist group on the soil of Afghanistan. They have stopped burning girls' schools and are allowing girls' education fully, even in the south and the east, their own areas. They have not attacked the Shias. If you remember, in the 90s, they massacred the Shias because the Taliban believe in a very strict Sunni sect. They have not massacred the Shias. And they're trying to actually forge better relations with all the non-Pashtun minorities in Afghanistan and the religious minorities. They have already said that for them, India is not an enemy, which of course is in a sense not something the Pakistanis want to hear, but something that the Indians certainly want to hear. I mean, messages have gone to the Indians saying this, that we want good relations with all the neighbors and all the near neighbors, and we don't want to be an enemy of anyone. So it would be a mixture of, conceding power in their areas, but also ensuring that the Taliban governors and administrators in these provinces carry out the central government's policies. Now, this is where we get into very tricky water, because here once you have a political settlement, then you need a constitutional settlement. And so far, the Taliban position is we want Sharia. We want Islamic law. And we don't accept this constitution. Mm-hmm. Now, that, obviously involves human rights, it involves women's rights, it involves the rights of the minorities, and the constitutional debate involves a lot of things. And again, I think there can be a compromise on this. Don't forget, 2014, there will be presidential elections. Karzai will have to step down. I hope he does. I hope there's a new figure, a new face heading Afghanistan at that time. And that will bring a new level of kind of freshness to, bringing the Afghan nation together, on this issue. And don't also forget that the government has to bring the non-Pashtuns into this discussion. Mm-hmm. Because so far, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks have been very much against talking to the Taliban.
Yes. Could I ask about generational change? Before the Arab Spring, things looked pretty hopeless in many Arab nations. And there was an old guard, an old establishment, very much totally in charge. Is there any kind of parallel that could come in Pakistan? Could there be a Pakistani Spring? Or could social media play a stronger role? Is there a difference, fundamental difference, between the views of younger, educated people in Pakistan and people who are now in charge?
You see, the basic difference between the Arab Spring in Pakistan is, if you have an Arab Spring in Pakistan, the leadership of that Arab Spring will immediately fall into the hands of the extremists and fundamentalists. Not because they're most popular, because they're the most organized. Civil society, the young people we're talking about, the young people who essentially I wrote this book for, are not organized. And there is no real political party which is voicing their demands. Imran does to a certain extent, but really not fully. The people who are really organized on the streets and have all the justification, the American presence in Afghanistan, the anti-Americanism, etc., the movement would immediately fall into it. So liberal Pakistanis are extremely nervous about anything like an Arab Spring, because it would lead to a fundamentalist wave. It would make the army more extreme, because the army would not oppose this. The army would certainly not oppose a fundamentalist movement which took to the streets in huge numbers in Pakistan. Now, right now, talks have started between the Americans and Pakistan, and all the fundamentalist groups, including Imran, has come out and said that if the government opens the road for the NATO and US supplies from Karachi to the border for Afghanistan, we will burn the trucks. Now, there's a lot of fear as to what could happen. I mean, this could turn into a fundamentalist street movement to burn, all US trucks moving, Pakistani trucks carrying US goods moving to the Afghan border. The other thing is, don't forget, there's another fundamental difference, and that is that all these dictators in the Middle East, they crushed the democratic aspirations of the middle classes and the secular part of the population. They also crushed the fundamentalists. So for 40 years in Egypt, you couldn't be a Muslim Brotherhood guy to function normally. Now you can. But what has been most significant to me, and which is really, I point this out all the time to Islamic politicians in Pakistan, that we also have a very powerful Muslim Brotherhood in Pakistan. It's called the Jamaat-e-Islami. It is the oldest and the most ideological of the Islamic parties. It fights elections, but it's become incredibly reactionary, in the last few years. It supports Osama bin Laden, it supports, suicide bombing, etc. And here you have all the Muslim Brotherhood parties, from Tunisia to Egypt, talking about democracy, women's rights, education, talking to the IMF, ties to the West, etc. Really modernizing in a very dramatic way. Yet our Muslim Brotherhood version of that is still so incredibly reactionary. It's not, and you have the example of the the Islamic Party in Turkey. So Pakistan remains a backwater in that sense, where the Islamists remain, wrapped up in this whole sort of jihad and anti-Americanism and all the rest of it, failing to provide anything for the people. So that's another, very big difference, that the kind of changes and modernization I see, on a day. You have now the Muslim Brotherhood taking on the army in Egypt and telling the Egyptian army, go home. Stop trying to manipulate the Constitution Assembly and stop trying to manipulate the situation. Now, in my opinion, playing a very positive role. And in fact, many of the liberal elite are divided. We should be supporting the Brotherhood because they're actually, opposing the military. Now, that situation doesn't arise. The militants and the extremists and the religious parties have always been in bed with the military in Pakistan. The anti-India, anti-America, interference in Afghanistan, whatever the case may be.